The parking lot was quiet. That was the first thing you would have noticed driving past Diner Everett's on that Tuesday evening in late October. The lot was fuller than it had ever been on any ordinary night, but the fullness was wrong because what filled it wasn't cars. More than 20 motorcycles sat in neat rows under the amber glow of the streetlights. Big machines, heavy chrome, the kind of bikes that carry weight in more ways than one. They filled every space in the lot and spilled out along the curb, and not a single engine was running. Not a single rider was moving. The men who belonged to those bikes stood beside them with their arms crossed and their eyes on the windows of the diner, and none of them said a word. Inside, visible through the glass, a man sat alone at a table in the center of the room. He was well-dressed, or he had been earlier in the day. Now his collar was open and his jacket hung off the back of his chair like something he'd stopped thinking about. He was maybe 38 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who carried himself like he owned whatever room he walked into. He wasn't carrying himself like that anymore. He was sitting very still and his hands were flat on the table in front of him, and on the table there was a single sheet of white paper and a pen. Nobody had told him to write anything. He already knew what he had to do. To understand how Derek Holt ended up in that chair with that piece of paper in front of him and 20-something men standing outside in the dark, you need to go back to the beginning of that same day. You need to go back to 6 in the morning, and you need to know about Maggie Callahan. The town of Harlan, Kentucky doesn't wake up all at once. It comes to life in pieces the way small towns always do. A light here, a truck's engine there, the smell of coffee drifting out from somewhere before you can see where it's coming from. In October, the mornings are cold and the sky stays dark longer than you want it to, and the walk from the parking lot to the front door of a place like Diner Everett's feels longer than it is. Maggie Callahan made that walk every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, rain or shine, for the better part of 11 years. She arrived at 5:50 in the morning, which was 10 minutes before she was technically required to be there, which meant she arrived at 5:50 every single time. She had a key. Jimmy had given it to her years ago, told her she didn't have to come in so early, told her the extra 10 minutes weren't going to make any difference. She kept coming at 5:50. Some habits are not about time. She was 68 years old. Small, the kind of small that made people underestimate her, which she had long since stopped being bothered by. Her hair was silver white, and she kept it pinned up while she worked, and she moved through the kitchen and the dining room with the calm efficiency of someone who had done the same thing long enough that the work had become part of her body. She didn't have to think about where the coffee filters were or which burner ran hot or which table legs were uneven and needed a folded napkin underneath. She knew all of it the way you know your own house in the dark. She put the coffee on first. Always. One pot for the customers and one for Jimmy, because Jimmy's pot was stronger than what she served the tables, and Jimmy needed the stronger version to function before 8 in the morning, and Maggie had known this about him for a long time. The diner itself was the kind of place that doesn't exist in cities anymore. Vinyl booths in a faded shade of burgundy that might have been red once 20 years ago. A long counter with round stools that spun if you were willing to put some effort into it. A chalkboard on the wall behind the register that listed the daily specials in Jimmy's handwriting, which had never been particularly legible, but which the regulars could read the way you learn to read a doctor's prescription, through repetition and context. The floor was wood dark and worn smooth in the paths between the tables, and the whole place smelled like coffee and bacon grease and something underneath that, something warm and old that had soaked into the walls over 4 decades of breakfast. On the back wall of the kitchen, among the health code certificates and the laminated prep schedules, there was a photograph. It had been there so long that nobody really looked at it anymore. 3 men standing in front of the diner on a bright day. The sign above the door was new in the photo, and one of the men was a younger Jimmy Everett, grinning in a way he didn't grin so easily these days. The man beside him was large and solid, with the hands of someone who worked with them, his arm around Jimmy's shoulders. At the edge of the frame, barely in it, stood a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, lean, dark-eyed looking, not at the camera, but at something just outside it. Someone had written along the bottom in careful blue ink, "Everett's opening day, 1987. Maggie glanced at it the way she always did, brief and automatic, when she passed it on her way to the front. Then she pushed through the swinging door and started setting up the tables. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron at 6:15. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. One name, Ray. She looked at it for a moment, her thumb hovering. Then she pressed the side button to silence it, slipped it back into her pocket, and kept moving. At 6:30, Jimmy came in. She heard him before she saw him, the rhythm of his footsteps, the way he always pushed the back door harder than necessary because the hinge caught. She'd been hearing those sounds for 11 years. She knew the difference between the way he moved on a good morning and the way he moved on a bad one, and this morning the difference was plain. He was 71 years old and he had always looked younger than that, at least for most of the time she'd known him. In the last few months, something had shifted. The weight had settled differently on him. His movements had a heaviness that wasn't age, it was worry carried too long without being set down. She poured his coffee without being asked the strong pot black and set it on the counter in front of him. He sat down on the stool nearest the register and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it without drinking. Jimmy, she said, not a question, just his name. I'm fine, he said. She let it go. He would talk when he was ready. That was one of the things about people who had known each other long enough. You learned when to ask and when to wait. And the waiting was sometimes its own kind of help. The first customers came in at 7, and the morning settled into its rhythm. Hank Briggs arrived at 7:45, same as always, with the same 2 men he had been eating breakfast with at this diner for 2 decades. Their names were Carol and Pete, and together the 3 of them occupied the booth by the second window from the door, with a consistency that had long since made it something close to a property right. Nobody sat in that booth when they were there. Nobody reached for it. Hank was 65, a retired county road supervisor with the hands and face of someone who had worked outside in Kentucky weather for 40 years. He'd known Maggie since before she started working at Everett's, back when her husband Dale was still alive, back when the 4 of them ended up at the same church potlucks and high school football games in the easy overlapping way of people who live close enough to share ordinary life. He ordered coffee black and the number 2 breakfast. Maggie brought it without him having to say a word. How's that son of yours, Maggie? Carol asked the way he occasionally did, with the easy curiosity of someone who had heard a name over the years, but knew little beyond it. Maggie smiled, the specific smile she had for that question, brief and warm, and closing nothing further. Busy, she said. Same as always. She refilled Carol's coffee and moved to the next table. The morning went on. At 8:30, a family of 4 came in, 2 parents. 2 kids, the younger one, maybe 5 years old, restless in the way of children who have been sitting still for too long. Maggie got them settled in the corner booth and brought coloring sheets for the kids and recommended the biscuits and gravy, which she knew were better on Tuesdays because Jimmy made the gravy fresh instead of using what was left from the day before. At 8:45, the front door opened and Derek Holt walked in. The change in the room was subtle but real. Maggie had worked in service long enough to feel the small atmospheric shifts that most people didn't consciously notice. A slight stiffening eyes that found reasons to look somewhere else, the way a room that had been relaxed quietly decided to be careful. It wasn't panic, it was collective awareness. Like when the weather changes and something in the air tells you before the clouds do. Derek Holt was not a stranger. This was his 4th visit in 2 weeks, and the regulars had learned enough about him in those 4 visits to understand what kind of man he was. He was the kind of man who looked at a room and evaluated it, then let you know through small, precise adjustments in his behavior exactly what he thought it was worth. He was tall and well-built, and he dressed in a way that announced its own cost. Dark slacks, a button-down, and a shade of blue that didn't belong in this diner's color palette shoes that had no business on the floor of a 40-year-old place in Harlan, Kentucky. He wore a watch that Carol had once leaned over to Pete and quietly noted could probably cover 6 months of mortgage. He didn't sit down right away. He stood just inside the door with his hands in his pockets and looked around the room with the expression of a man taking inventory of a space he already considers his. Then he walked toward the booth by the second window. Hank's booth. Hank and Carol and Pete were mid-conversation, coffee cups, half-full plates not yet cleared. Derek stopped at the end of the table. Didn't say good morning. You gentlemen mind moving to another table? I need this one. Not a question. The words were shaped like one, but they weren't. Hank looked up at him. A pause, the kind where a man is deciding something. Then Hank looked at Maggie, who was nearby with a coffee pot, and something passed between them, and Hank nodded once and stood up. Sure thing, he said in a voice that was completely flat. He and Carol and Pete moved 3 booths back. Derek settled into their seat like it had been waiting for him. Maggie gave it a moment, then she walked over with a menu. He didn't look up when she placed it on the table. Coffee, he said, and have someone else bring it out. I don't like watching shaky hands carry things. He said it the way you'd say I prefer decaf. His eyes stayed on his phone. Maggie set the menu down precisely at the edge of the table. She turned and walked back toward the counter. She didn't hurry and she didn't slow down. She picked up the coffee pot and poured a cup and carried it to Derek's table herself. He didn't say anything when she put it down, which was, she understood, its own kind of statement. In the kitchen, Jimmy was standing at the counter with his back to her, and when she pushed through the swinging door, she could see, from the set of his shoulders, that he already knew who was sitting in the dining room. He's here, she said. Jimmy nodded without turning. He wants to sign today. Called me this morning. Said he wasn't coming back after today. Said we've had enough time. Maggie looked at the back of her friend's head for a moment. Then she picked up the next order from the pass and carried it out front. The morning got busier. By 9:15, the diner was near capacity contractors who started early and needed a real breakfast, a table of women from the Methodist Church who came in after their Tuesday morning Bible study, a couple of farmers at the counter who worked through their eggs in comfortable silence. At 9:20, the 5-year-old from the corner booth launched herself off her seat in pursuit of something dropped under the next table, and she cut directly across Maggie's path at the exact moment Maggie was carrying a tray with 2 waters and a glass of orange juice. The collision was small. The child bounced off Maggie's knee without falling. Maggie pulled the tray back and controlled it, kept the waters level, but the orange juice tipped over the edge, and the glass came down and it didn't break, but the juice went in an arc that covered 3 feet of floor tile and the left shoe of Derek Holt. He was out of his seat in an instant. The mother was already apologizing, hand on her daughter's shoulder, face flushed. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she just ran. But Derek wasn't looking at the mother. He was looking at his shoe. Then he looked at Maggie. "You know what these kaswang?" His voice was even almost pleasant. "You could work a month in this place and it wouldn't cover a pair of these." His companion, a younger man who had been sitting across from him with his phone face up all morning, glanced at the shoe and made a sound that was close to a laugh. The mother stopped apologizing. The family at the nearest table stopped talking. The farmers at the counter kept eating, but their movements slowed. "I'm sorry," Maggie said. "Let me get something to—" "Just clean it up," Derek said, and turned back to his seat. Maggie got the mop. She cleaned the floor, working steadily and without rushing, because she always worked that way, and because some things you do not let show. Not in a full room on a Tuesday morning, not in front of customers watching from behind their coffee cups, with the studied inattention of people who were in fact watching very closely. When she finished, she carried the mop back to the kitchen. Carla, 23 years old, 8 months at Everett, standing behind the counter, watched her go. The young man with Derek turned his phone face down and looked at the table. He had stopped looking like a man checking messages and started looking like a man trying to decide where to put his eyes. Nobody said anything. The silverware kept moving. The morning continued in the way mornings do, carrying what had happened inside it absorbed into the ordinary sounds of the room. At 9:40, Derek got up from his table and knocked on the half-open door of the small office at the back of the diner. Jimmy was in there working through the paperwork that a place like this generated in small grinding amounts, invoices, schedules, the arithmetic of staying open. He looked up when Derek knocked, and Maggie, who was close by restocking napkin dispensers, heard the door click, mostly shut. She wasn't trying to listen. She was just close enough, and what she heard was enough. Derek's voice, even and businesslike. "Mr. Everett, I know what you owe the bank, and I know when the deadline is. I've been patient. I've given you time. We're past the point where time helps you." Jimmy's voice lowered with a rough edge in it. "This place has been in my family for 40 years. 40 years is history," Derek said. "History doesn't pay banknotes. Sign the papers, I write the check, and you walk away clean. That's the deal." Then quieter, "There's no other deal. I want you to understand that clearly." A silence. Then the sound of a chair and footsteps toward the door. Maggie moved away from the napkin dispensers and was at the far end of the counter by the time the office door opened. She stood there with a stack of napkins in her hands, looking at the far wall, and something in her face had changed, not dramatically, nothing anyone would have pointed to. Just a settling, a small quiet shift like a key turning in a lock she'd been carrying for a while. She went back to work. Derek returned to the dining room and ordered a second coffee, and the morning went on. At 10:05, Maggie passed close to his table, and her elbow brushed the back of his chair, a small accidental contact, the kind that happens 50 times a day in a room this size, and she didn't notice it because she was focused on the plate in her hand and the table in front of her, and the next 3 things she needed to do. Derek felt it. He turned and looked at her. "Did you just touch me?" The conversations around them didn't stop, but they got quieter, and people who had been looking at their plates began looking at something closer to the center of the room. "I'm sorry," Maggie said. "I wasn't paying. You keep touching things you're not supposed to touch." His voice had a different quality now, still controlled, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. First the shoes, now this. "It was an accident. I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment, the slow, thorough look of a man assessing something, then turned toward the office doorway. "Mr. Everett," Jimmy appeared from the kitchen doorway. His face was carefully composed in the way that it gets when you're preparing for something you've been dreading. "Mr. Everett," Derek said again, his voice back in its reasonable business register. "I want this woman off the floor. Today, consider it a condition of our arrangement." The room had gone very quiet. Carla behind the counter had stopped moving entirely. Hank's fork was down. Jimmy stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open. And Maggie looked at him, and she could see him trying to find the words, trying to locate the way through, trying to figure out how to answer in a situation where every available option was going to cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she made the decision herself. She untied her apron. It was slow and deliberate. She reached behind her back, pulled the ties loose, lifted the apron over her head. She folded it in half the way she always folded it at the end of a shift, and she carried it to the counter and set it down. Derek watched this with the small, satisfied expression of a man who has just seen something complicated become simple. And then Maggie did the thing he didn't expect. She didn't pick up her purse. She didn't walk toward the door. She stood where she was next to the counter, apron folded on the surface beside her, and she turned and faced him. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't move toward him. She was simply standing there and looking at him, and the look was not apologetic and not frightened, and not the look of someone about to leave. He was used to certain responses from certain people. He was used to looking at someone and watching them understand what they were. He had built a professional life on being able to read the small vocabulary of capitulation, the dropped eyes, the turned shoulders, the hands that found something else to do. He read it fluently, and he had always found it reliable. This was not that. She was looking at him steadily from across the room, not defiant in any way he could name, not challenging, just present. Like she'd been in this room longer than he'd been anywhere, and that was simply a fact. He didn't like it. He stood up. He walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be a statement, and dropped his voice low. "What exactly are you looking at?" Maggie didn't answer, didn't shift her weight. "Do you have any idea?" He stopped, because the stillness of it had gotten under his skin in a way that a response wouldn't have, and he was not a man who handled that well, and he made a decision that was fast and unthinking and would spend a long time following him. He hit her, not hard enough to knock her over, not a vicious blow which in some ways made it worse. It was the casual slap of a man who didn't think it would cost him anything. Flat-palmed across the side of her face, and the sound of it was sharp in the quiet room, and Maggie's head turned with the impact, and she stepped back once to catch her balance. Then there was nothing, no sound. Nobody spoke. The family in the corner booth, the men at the counter, the women from the Methodist church, all of them had gone still in the way you go still when something happens that you will be thinking about later in the dark trying to sleep. Derek looked around the room. For the first time that morning, something in his expression shifted into a register that wasn't quite certainty. He sat back down, picked up his coffee cup. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said to nobody in particular. "She startled me. She startled me in front of 30 people. Maggie stood with her hand raised to her cheek. She looked at him, the same look, still quiet, still without the vocabulary of defeat. Then she reached down and picked up her apron from the counter. She didn't put it back on. She didn't set it down. She held it in one hand and walked to the back of the diner, through the kitchen and out the back door into the cold October morning. The door swung shut behind her. Carla took a step toward the back, then stopped. Hank's hand was flat on the table. The youngest child in the corner booth said something to her mother in a small voice that nobody could hear, and her mother pulled her close without answering. Behind the counter, the coffee maker made its small, indifferent sound. The back of Diner Everett's faced a narrow service alley, and beyond the alley a chain-link fence, and beyond that a strip of scrub grass that had just appeared over the years, the way things appear in the gaps between structures. There was a wooden step at the back door, 2 risers weathered gray. Maggie sat on the lower one. The air was cold enough to see her breath. She sat with her apron folded across her knees and looked out at the alley and the fence and the empty strip of ground beyond, and her hand rested against her cheek, and she was very still. After a while, she reached into the pocket of her apron, took out her phone, found the number she had silenced an hour ago, pressed it. 1 ring. The voice on the other end was deep and measured, the voice of a man who had trained himself out of rushing, who had learned somewhere along the way that speed and deliberateness are not the same thing. "Mama." "Ray," she said, not upset, not crying, just his name, the way she'd always said it, the same way she'd said it when he was 17 and needed to come fix something in the house. "I need you here." 7 words, 3 seconds of silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't understand, the silence of someone who understood completely. "I'm on my way." The call ended. Maggie sat on the step and looked at the fence. She had not called Ray when the roof over the back bedroom started leaking 3 winters ago, and a bucket filled up twice a night. She had not called when someone broke her car window in the grocery store parking lot, and it took her 3 weeks to save enough to replace it. She had not called when she was in the hospital for 2 days after the appendix surgery, when she filled out the intake forms alone and watched the other beds get visited and said nothing to anyone about it. She'd always said she was fine. She'd always been in the ways that mattered right. But what was coming for Everett's wasn't a leaky roof. It wasn't a broken window. What was coming was the kind of thing that doesn't fix itself. The kind of thing that requires a different sort of answer. Some things you couldn't carry alone. And there was no shame in knowing which things those were. The cold settled around her. She waited. Her breath made small clouds in the air, and the morning went on without her for the first time in 11 years. Inside behind the counter, Carla was watching the back door. In the booth 3 rows back, Hank Briggs had his phone on the table. The screen was lit. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he's already done and is now deciding whether he did it soon enough. And Derek Holt was at the window table finishing his coffee, reviewing the documents in his briefcase, already composing in his mind the call he would make when the signature was on the paper. He was not thinking about the woman on the step outside. He was not thinking about the 7 words she had said or the 3 seconds of silence that followed them. He was not thinking about any of it. He would be soon enough. Carla pushed through the back door at 10:25. The cold hit her, and she pulled her sleeves down over her wrists and stood adjusting. Maggie was still on the step, in the same position, the apron across her knees, her breath making small clouds. "Maggie," Carla said. Maggie looked up. "You should call the police. What he did, that's assault. You have every right." "I know what I have the right to," Maggie said. Quiet and certain, the way people are certain about things they've thought through completely. "Sit down a minute." Carla sat. The concrete was cold through her jeans. "I owe you an apology," Carla said. "I was standing right there and I didn't do anything." "You're 23 and you need this job." "That's not an excuse." "No," Maggie agreed. "It's a reason. There's a difference. People have reasons. You don't have to be ashamed of them. You just have to know what they are." Carla turned the dish towel over in her hands. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you. I've been holding on to it for 2 years and I didn't know what to do with it. But after what I just stood there and watched happen in that room," she stopped, started again. "I think I've been afraid of the wrong things." Maggie turned to look at her. Carla pulled out her phone. She scrolled back through her photos a significant distance and turned the screen toward Maggie. A screenshot of a text message thread. The name at the top, Derek Holt. Maggie took the phone. She read slowly, giving each word its weight. The messages were 2 years old. Sent to a man named Gerald Price, who Carla explained in a low voice was the father of her best friend from high school, a man who had lived outside Lawrenceburg where Derek had been assembling a similar project. Gerald Price had opposed it, organized some neighbors, spoken at a planning meeting. Derek's messages were careful, written by a man who understood plausible deniability. Nothing you could point to in isolation and call a crime. But read in sequence, they told a clear story. Gerald Price's son needed work. Jobs in the construction trades were hard to come by for young men without connections. Certain connections could be arranged for people who understood the bigger picture, and those same connections could prove difficult to establish for people who made things complicated without good reason. The last message was short. "I'd hate for your family to miss out on an opportunity because of a misunderstanding between neighbors. Think it over." Gerald Price had thought it over. He'd stopped coming to the planning meetings. His neighbors, without his voice, had eventually stopped fighting. The project went through. Maggie read the messages twice. Then she handed the phone back. "He does this everywhere he goes," Carla said. "That's what my friend told me. Her dad never got over it. He felt like he'd sold something he couldn't get back." She paused. "I kept the screenshots because I thought someday they might matter. But I'm just one person and he has money and lawyers and I didn't know who to give it to." Maggie looked at her for a long moment. "You know who to give it to now," she said. Carla didn't know exactly what that meant, but something in the way Maggie said it made her feel for the first time since she'd come outside that the weight of holding that secret for 2 years was about to become someone else's problem. She nodded. They sat together on the step for a while, and then Maggie said, "Go back inside, keep an eye on Jimmy." Carla went back inside. Maggie stayed where she was. At some point after 10:30, Jimmy came out. He moved carefully in the cold and sat down beside her in the space Carla had left, and neither of them said anything for nearly a minute. "I'm sorry," Jimmy said. "Don't be. I should have said something when he—" "Jimmy," her voice was gentle, but it stopped him. "Stop." He was quiet. Jimmy Everett was a proud man in the way men of his generation and background were proud, not loud about it, but structurally proud in a way that meant he would carry almost any burden alone before admitting it existed. Maggie had watched him do it for 11 years. She had watched it cost him. "There's something I haven't told you," he said. "Something I should have told you months ago." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and brought out an envelope. Old, the paper had gone soft at the corners, yellowed the way paper does when it's been handled and put away, and handled again over many years. He held it in both hands and looked at it. When Dale lent me the money back in 2009, when I almost had to close, he also gave me this. He held the envelope out. He wrote it himself, had it witnessed by a notary public, called it a right of first refusal. Said that if there ever came a time when I had to sell the diner, the Callahan family had the first right to buy it before anyone else at a fair price. He paused. He said it was just a formality, said he didn't expect it would ever need to matter. Maggie took the envelope. She didn't open it. She knew the handwriting on the outside, would have known it anywhere in any context after 40 years of grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table. She sat with it in her hands. I kept it because I thought it would never matter, Jimmy said. I thought I'd die in that building. But now this man is telling me it isn't mine to decide about anyway, because the bank will take it if I don't sign his papers. He looked at the fence. I don't know if that piece of paper means anything anymore, but I thought you should have it. I thought you should know it existed. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Before Dale left for work the morning he had his accident, she said, "Do you know what he told me?" Jimmy shook his head. He said he'd called you the night before because you'd sounded strange on the phone. He said you didn't want to talk about it, but he could tell something was wrong. He said he was going to stop by the diner on his way home that evening. Jimmy looked at the fence. He never stopped worrying about you, Maggie said. Not once. She looked down at the envelope. He would want this handled right, not fast, not angry, right. She put the envelope in the pocket of her apron next to her phone. Don't sign anything today, she said. Can you do that for me? Jimmy looked at her. Something in his face had changed, some weight redistributed, the way it shifts when you've been carrying something wrong and someone shows you a better way to hold it. I can do that, he said. They sat together for a few more minutes, and then they both stood up and went back inside. In the dining room, Derek Holt was on his phone. He was near the windows, turned slightly from the room, speaking in the low, efficient voice of a man conducting business. Carla was behind the counter, wiping the same section of surface she had been wiping for 4 minutes. She had good hearing. She heard, "The old man will sign. I've already taken care of the bank side. He thinks he's out of options because he is out of options." A pause. Nobody's going to be a problem. Some locals got loud, but they don't have anything they can actually use. By tomorrow, this is over. Another pause, a short laugh. Trust me, there's nobody in this town with enough weight to stop this. He pocketed the phone and turned back toward the room. At the table where Derek had been sitting, his assistant, the young man who had been there all morning, had his phone face down. He had been on it continuously since they arrived, the studied inattention of someone who made themselves absent from situations by staying busy with something smaller. But now the phone was face down and he was looking at the table, and his face had the expression of a man trying to decide where to put a feeling he hadn't expected to have. He looked up and found Carla looking at him. Neither of them said anything. He turned the phone over, put it back face down, looked at the table again. Carla looked away first, but she had heard what Derek said and heard the thing underneath it, the certainty that the people in this town were exactly who they appeared to be, that they could be read at a glance and counted, and the count came out in his favor. He had been in Harlan 4 times. He had watched the room each time with those evaluating eyes of his. He had not seen what was in it. At 11:10, Derek found Jimmy behind the counter and revised his timeline. He didn't want to wait until the end of the week. He would need the signature this afternoon. 2 o'clock, he said. I'll have the paperwork ready. You sign, we're done. You don't sign. A slight shrug, the gesture of a man for whom the outcome was already settled. The bank calls your note and you deal with that yourself. Jimmy stood with his hands flat on the counter and said, I'll need until 2. 2 o'clock, Derek confirmed. I'll be back. He picked up his briefcase from the window table and walked out the front door. The bell rang once. The diner was quiet. Carol looked at Pete. Pete looked at his coffee. Hank had both hands around his mug, looking at the front door. He was not looking at his phone. Maggie stood at the end of the counter. She looked at the clock on the wall, which read 11:12. She did the arithmetic. Then she looked out the front window at the road that turned off the main county route, about 4 miles east of town, the road that ran alongside the river before it reached the long gravel drive, going up the hill to the building that most people in Harlan knew about and had the sense not to involve themselves with unnecessarily. She had called Ray at 10:22. He said he was on his way. 50 minutes ago, she looked at the road. Carla heard it first. The diner was quiet and her hearing was good, and she heard it before anyone else acknowledged it. A low sound at the edge of perception, rhythmic and deep, coming from the east. She set down the coffee pot she was holding. The sound grew. Not rushing, not the urgency of emergency. It came at its own pace, steady and building, the way a sound multiplies when there are many sources moving together. Pete looked up. Carol said, that's a lot of... And then they were there. The first motorcycle turned off the county road onto the street in front of Everett's. And even before the others followed, you could see it was not a weekend rider on a trail bike. This was a machine ridden by someone who had spent years on one, moving with the economy of long practice. The chrome caught the flat October light. Then the second came around the corner. Then the third. They came in a loose formation, not rushed, not dramatic, the way a group of men move when they have somewhere to be and know how to get there. They pulled into the lot and along the curb on both sides of the street, and one by one the engines went silent, and one by one the riders settled into stillness. And by the time the last one took its place, there were 23 motorcycles in front of Diner Everett's, and not one was still running. The men didn't come inside. They stood beside their bikes with their arms crossed, and they looked at the front of the diner, and they waited. Inside, nobody spoke. Hank was standing. He didn't remember deciding to stand. He was just standing, looking out the window, and something in his face had changed in a way that Carol would describe later to his wife as the face of a man who's just been told something he already knew, but needed to hear out loud. The rider from the first bike had dismounted. He was the one who'd come around the corner first, who'd pulled closest to the entrance, and now he stood looking at the front of the diner through the window. He was genuinely tall, the actual fact of it, not the impression, with the breadth in his shoulders that comes from years of real work. He wore a jacket that was black leather and worn in the way of something used for 20 years rather than displayed. On the back and on the front left chest, there was a patch. The regulars couldn't read it clearly from where they sat, but Hank standing near the window could. Iron Ridge MC. And below it, President Aman. The man stood for a moment looking at the front of the diner. Then he walked not through the front door, but around the side of the building toward the back. Carla was already moving. She came from behind the counter, went through the kitchen, and got to the back door and opened it, and she stood in the doorway and watched. Maggie was still on the step, or had come back to it, sitting the same way she'd been sitting, and she looked up when she heard the footsteps, and the man came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her. He was older up close, mid-40s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that belonged to someone who had spent years outdoors, years not sleeping well, years carrying things. The specific aging of a life that asked a great deal. His eyes were dark and still, and they were on Maggie, with an intensity that was not alarming, because it was not anger. It was the intensity of a man for whom this moment, this specific sight, was the most important thing currently happening in the world. He stopped 2 feet from her. Then he crouched down unhurried, and he put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her face, the left side of it, where the mark was still faintly visible, and something moved behind his eyes that he didn't allow to reach his face. "Mama," he said, barely above a murmur, the way words are said when they have been said 10,000 times and still mean everything they ever meant. Maggie put her hand over his hand on her shoulder. She looked at him the way she looked at him when he came home from things, assessing, searching, finding the things she needed to find. She found it. He was calm. "Good. Before you do anything," she said, "sit down and let me tell you everything. From the beginning. Will you do that?" He sat on the step beside her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He rested his forearms on his knees and turned his face toward his mother, and he listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He listened the way he had listened to her since he was old enough to understand that the things she said were worth understanding, and he let her tell it in her own order and her own time. And when she was done, he sat with it for a moment in the cold air of the alley. Then he stood up. "Stay out here a few minutes," he said. He went inside. The kitchen was warm after the cold, and Carla stepped back when he came through the door, because he was in an enclosed space considerably larger than he appeared from a distance. He nodded at her once, a nod that acknowledged her and meant it, then looked around the kitchen. Jimmy was standing at the prep counter, not doing anything, just standing with his hands on the surface. He looked up when Ray came through the door, and whatever he'd been bracing for, whatever version of this moment he had prepared himself to face, this was not it, because his eyes went wide for just a moment, and his breath came out in a way that was not entirely controlled. "Ray," he said, low and rough, with something in it that was neither grief nor relief exactly, but held both. "Sit down, Uncle Jimmy," Ray said. He hadn't called him that since he was a teenager. The words landed in the room in their own way. Jimmy sat on the stool near the back counter. Ray pulled a prep stool over and sat across from him. Carla moved to the far end of the kitchen and found something to do with her hands, and did not look at them directly, understanding that she was witnessing something private, even though it was happening in front of her. Ray listened to Jimmy the way he had listened to Maggie, completely, without the small sounds and movements people make when they are waiting for their turn to speak. He listened as Jimmy told him about the bank, about the debt and the deadline, and the way the numbers had stopped adding up over 2 years, and the way he had handled that by telling nobody, working longer hours, hoping the arithmetic would change on its own. About Derek Holt and how he'd first approached Jimmy 6 weeks ago, and the way every conversation had been structured from the start, so it moved in only one direction. Then Jimmy got up and went to the cabinet above the dry goods shelf and reached to the very back of it, past the industrial salt containers and backup coffee filters, and brought out the old envelope. He held it a moment, then brought it to Ray. Ray took it. He looked at the outside at the handwriting, his father's handwriting, which he had not seen in 7 years, and he was still for a moment in a way that was different from his general stillness. Then he opened it and read what was inside. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and held it in both hands. "You hold on to this," he said. He handed it back to Jimmy. Jimmy took it. His hands weren't steady, and he didn't try to make them steady. "You should have called me months ago," Ray said. "I know. Not about the money, about any of it." Jimmy looked at the floor. "My father lent you that money because he wanted to," Ray said. "He wouldn't want it back. You know that." "I know. What I need from you right now is the name of the person at the bank, the one this man has been working with." Jimmy looked up. "He said it himself," Ray said, without knowing he was saying anything. "My mother has good ears, and so does your other employee." He nodded toward Carla, and Carla felt the back of her neck go warm. "He's been working someone inside to make sure you don't have a path out. I need to know who." Jimmy gave him the name. Ray heard it and sat with it for a moment, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the look of a man who has turned over a rock and found what he half expected. He took out his phone, made a call, turned slightly away, not all the way, just enough to indicate the conversation was not for the room. 3 sentences. A name, 1 question, 1 answer, 40 seconds. He put the phone away. "The bank will extend your deadline," he said, 6 months. "You'll have a letter by end of week." Jimmy stared at him. "That gives you time to find your own way through this without selling. Not to this man, not today, not because someone built a wall around you and told you there was no door." Jimmy opened his mouth, closed it. "He's coming back at 2 o'clock, Carla said from the far end of the kitchen. Her voice was steady. "He said he wants the signature this afternoon." Ray looked at her. "Then we have time," he said. He stood and moved toward the swinging door, and he pushed through it, and he stepped out into the dining room. The room was not full anymore. The late morning lull had cleared most of the casual customers, and what remained were the people who had been there all morning and had not left, the people who had made a choice, whether or not they understood it that way, by staying. Hank and Carol and Pete were in their booth. Hank was standing near the window. 2 other tables had customers who had come in after the incident and knew nothing about it. Ray stood in the center of the room and looked at it. A full quiet read the way his mother looked at rooms. Then he pulled out a chair at the center table where the whole room was visible in every direction, and he sat down and put his hands flat on the table and looked at the front door. Carla brought coffee without being asked and set it down and went back to the counter. Ray looked at the cup, then at the door. The next hour moved the way hours move in a quiet room when the people in it are waiting for something slowly, with a texture to the slowness each minute distinguishable from the last. At 12:30, Jimmy came out of the kitchen carrying plates and set them on the counter and said to no one in particular that there was food if anyone wanted it. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was what he knew how to do in a room that needed something to do with itself. Hank ate. Carol ate. Ray ate half a plate and pushed it aside. Maggie came back inside at 12:45. She came through the kitchen and tied her apron on without ceremony, and she moved back into the dining room and picked up the coffee pot and topped off cups that needed it, moving the way she always moved, with the quiet, steady attention of someone who understood that small acts of ordinary care were not nothing, were in fact the opposite of nothing. At 1:15, she sat down across from Ray for a few minutes, and they were quiet together, and then she stood and went back to work. At 1:40, Hank checked his phone for the 3rd time, making sure the video was saved in 2 separate places. At 1:50, the room went still in a new way, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of readiness. 2 different things. Ray looked at the clock, then at the door. Outside, the men beside the motorcycle straightened almost imperceptibly. Derek Holt had driven the 12 miles from his hotel in the specific silence of a man running the same calculation on a loop and not liking what it kept returning. He had called his lawyer from the road. The lawyer had listened and then recommended he say very little until they had spoken properly, and Derek had ended the call and driven the rest of the way without reaching out to anyone else. He pulled into the lot at 1:53. The motorcycles were still there. He had half expected them to be gone, told himself on the drive over that they were a display, that men like that made gestures and then went home. 23 machines said otherwise. They were where they'd been when he left, maybe with a slightly different arrangement, and the men belonging to them were where they'd been. He sat in his car longer than he intended to. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up his briefcase, got out. He walked toward the front door without looking left or right, which required more effort than he would have admitted. The men watched him cross the lot, not moving, not calling out, not doing anything that could be called a threat. They simply stood there with their complete attention on him, and the watching had a quality to it, knowing patient entirely without urgency that was different from the watching he was accustomed to. He was used to being looked at by people who wanted something from him or were afraid of him. This was neither. He pushed through the front door. The bell rang once. The room he walked into was not the room he'd left 2 hours ago. The casual late-morning customers were gone. What remained were the essential people, the three older men in the booth, the young woman behind the counter, the old man visible through the kitchen pass-through. And at the center table where Derek himself had been sitting that morning, a man sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at him. Derek stopped just inside the door. He took in the jacket, the patch, the quality of stillness in the man's posture, which was not the stillness of someone waiting nervously, but the stillness of someone who had decided stillness was the right tool for this moment and was using it with full intention. He looked around the rest of the room. Everyone was looking at him. Nobody looked away. He set his jaw and walked to the table. He stood at the edge of it, using the geometry of the situation to establish something before a word was said, the way he always did, the way that usually worked. Ray looked up at him without adjusting his posture. "You can sit down," Ray said, "or you can stand there. Either way, I'm going to say what I came to say." Derek pulled out the chair across from Ray and sat. "I don't know who you are," Derek said. "Ray Callahan." He said it without emphasis. "Maggie Callahan is my mother." Something moved behind Derek's eyes, brief, controlled, but present. A recalculation. "I understand you're upset," Derek said, his voice finding its reasonable business register. "What happened this morning was—" "I'm not going to talk about what happened this morning yet," Ray said. "I want to talk about your deal first. The acquisition. Walk me through it, timeline, financing, who your principals are." Derek looked at him. "That's not your business. I'm making it my business. Not aggressive, not raised, just a statement of what was going to happen." Derek looked at him for a long moment, running the fast internal accounting of leverage and exposure that had served him well in a lot of difficult rooms. But this room had variables he hadn't encountered before, and the awareness of them made the calculations slower than usual. "I'm using private investment capital," he said finally. "One primary backer. I acquire the properties, develop the site, split the return. And your backer knows about everything you've done in connection with this acquisition. Of course, including the work you did with the bank." A pause. "Present. I have a relationship with people at the bank," Derek said. "That's standard in this business." "You use that relationship to close off Jimmy Everett's options," Ray said. "Not to negotiate, to eliminate. There's a difference, and the person on the other end of that relationship is going to have a problem explaining it if it comes up in the wrong context." Derek leaned forward slightly. The reasonable voice had acquired an edge. "I don't know what you think you know, but I've operated well within—" Ray put his phone on the table. The screen was facing up. The screenshot was already open. Gerald Price's text thread. Derek's messages, the careful language of a man who understood plausible deniability but had underestimated the longevity of a safe screenshot. Ray didn't say anything. He just put it on the table and let Derek look at it. Derek looked at it. The color in his face changed, not the theatrical blanching of someone in a movie, but the controlled, specific change of a man who has just found a door in a wall he thought he'd built solid. "That's 2 years old," he said. "Those messages don't—" "They do," Ray said. "You know they do. I know they do. Your backers' lawyers will know they do, which is the part that matters." He paused. "That's one thing. Here's the second." He looked at Carla. She came out from behind the counter and walked to the table and set her own phone down beside Ray's. The video was cued. She pressed play. The sound was not loud, but the room was quiet enough. 30 seconds. The flat crack of palm on face. Maggie's head turning. The awful silence of a room full of people who did not react. Derek watched it. His jaw was set. He watched it the way you watch something that cannot be stopped from being what it is. "That's in 3 places right now," Ray said. "Nothing public yet." He let that sit. "Yet." Derek was quiet. "And the third thing," Ray said, "the person at the bank you've been working with, that arrangement has been corrected. Mr. Everett has a 6-month extension on his note. The structure you built, the timeline, the pressure, the closed exits, it's gone." The room was completely silent. Hank was standing, had been standing since Derek walked in, arms crossed, face carrying an expression that Carol would later describe simply to his wife as satisfied. Derek sat with the mathematics of the situation working themselves out in his eyes in real-time messages. Video collapse bank arrangement running it against what he had. The totals were not coming out the way he needed them to. He put his hands together on the table. What do you want? He said. Three things, Ray said. First, you withdraw from the Everett's acquisition permanently today. Derek said nothing. Second, you call your backer right now in this room and you tell him you're withdrawing, not tonight, now. Silence. Third, Ray said, you write a letter of apology to my mother, by hand, signed, before you leave this table. Several seconds of silence. Then Derek quieter stripped down to something more fundamental. And if I do those three things, the video stays where it is, Ray said. The messages stay where they are. We're done. Derek looked at his hands, at the phone with the messages, at the phone with the video, at the room the faces turned toward him, none offering the social escape hatch of inattention that people sometimes offer each other in difficult moments. Nobody was offering him anything. He picked up his phone. He made the call. 2 rings. Then a voice older with the clipped precision of someone who manages serious money and does not enjoy surprises. Derek, flat. I've been waiting to hear from you. I'm calling about the Harlan Project, Derek said. His voice was controlled, but the control was working harder than usual. I need to tell you I'm withdrawing. A pause. I'm looking at something on my phone, the voice said. Someone sent it to me about an hour ago. A video. Is this the property you've been working? Derek's jaw tightened. Yes. You struck an employee at the site, an elderly woman. Not a question. I'm not interested in context right now, the voice said. I'm interested in the fact that you made arrangements with a bank contact regarding the seller's credit situation without informing me. Is that accurate? Hank across the room could hear the voice through the phone. It was standard. Derek. Not raised. It didn't need to be. Withdraw from the acquisition and then come to my office. We have a number of things to discuss that have nothing to do with Harlan. The call ended. Derek sat with the phone in his hand. Then he set it on the table. He looked at the table surface. The old laminate worn smooth at the edges from years of hands and elbows, the surface of thousands of ordinary mornings that knew nothing about this particular one. A sound to his left, a chair moving the quiet scrape of it on the floor. He looked up. His assistant was standing. The young man who had been with him all morning, who had laughed at the comment about Maggie's shoes, who had spent the morning with his phone face up, who had turned it face down sometime around mid-morning and not turned it back. He was standing with his jacket in one hand, and his face had the expression of a man who has been watching a situation develop and has reached the point where watching it is no longer a thing he can do. He picked up the rental car keys from the table, set them down in front of Derek. He looked at Derek for a moment, not with triumph, not with accusation, just with the steady look of a young man who has made a decision and is finished making it. I'll find my own way back, he said. He walked to the door. The bell rang. He was gone. Derek sat alone at the table. The room was still. Not the stillness of avoidance, not the collective silence of 30 people deciding not to be present. This was the stillness of people who were completely present, who had chosen to be there, who were witnessing something they had each in their own way waited all morning to see. The kitchen door swung open. Maggie came out. She was wearing her apron. She had put it back on at some point, not as a declaration, not in ceremony, just the way you put on the thing you wear when you're at work, because it was where she worked and she was there. She moved through the room the way she always moved through it, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been doing the same thing long enough that the room itself had become part of her. 2 cups of coffee, one in front of Ray, one at the empty place beside him. She pulled out the chair and sat down. She looked at Derek. He looked back at her. A man who had done something wrong, looking at the person he'd done it to. Finding that she was not looking at him with what he expected, not rage, not injury, not the reactions that would have given him a framework. She was just looking at him, steadily without performance. I want to say something to you, she said. Her voice was even, not kind, not unkind, real. You walked into this place this morning, and you decided what everyone in it was worth, she said. You looked at Jimmy and decided what he was worth. Looked at Carla and decided. Looked at those men at the counter and decided. Looked at me. She paused. You added everyone up, and the answer you got was not enough. Not enough to be careful with. Not enough to matter. Derek said nothing. The thing is, you were wrong about every one of us, she said. But that's not actually what I want you to understand. What I want you to understand is that it wouldn't have mattered if you'd been right. It wouldn't have mattered if we were exactly who we looked like to you, a diner full of small people with small lives in a small town. She looked at him steadily. A person who carries plates deserves to be treated like a person. That's not complicated. It's just what's true. She turned the coffee cup slightly in her hands. You put your hand on me, she said, in front of 30 people. And you did it because you thought it wouldn't cost you anything, because it hadn't cost you anything before. And I want you to think about that, not about today, but about all the times before today when you were right. All the people who are out there somewhere who paid a price you never paid because no one happened to be watching. She picked up her coffee cup. That's all I wanted to say. She drank. Ray had been watching his mother while she spoke. When she finished, he looked at Derek and put a piece of paper on the table, plain white, folded once. He unfolded it and set it flat in front of Derek with a pen beside it. "Take your time," he said. Derek looked at the paper. He looked at the room, the faces there waiting, not crowding him, not hovering, just constituting the fact of the moment by being present for it. Hank near the window, Carol and Pete in the booth, Carla behind the counter, Jimmy at the edge of the room with his hands in his apron pockets. Derek picked up the pen. He wrote. It took 4 minutes. When he set the pen down, he pushed the paper toward Ray. Ray read it once, giving each word its weight. Then he turned it on the table and slid it toward Maggie. She picked it up. She read it. Her face didn't change while she read, didn't shift into any expression that gave the room information about what was on the page. She just read it, and when she was done, she folded it once in half, the way she folded things she intended to keep, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. The same pocket where she kept her phone. The same pocket where she'd put Dale's envelope. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Derek Holt stood up. He collected his documents from the table, the contracts, the folder, the legal pad with his notes, and he put them in his briefcase with the movements of a man doing something for the last time. He picked up his jacket and put it on, and for a moment, just a moment, the old habit showed through the habit of looking a certain way in a room, of carrying himself so that the geometry of his posture said what he needed it to say. There was nothing left to say. The habit didn't hold. He looked at Jimmy. "The acquisition is withdrawn," he said. "You'll get written confirmation by end of week." Jimmy nodded once, said nothing. Derek walked to the front door. He pushed through. The bell rang. The cold was immediate. He crossed the lot. The men watched him the way they had watched him arrive, but it was not the same watching. When he had walked in that afternoon, their attention had the quality of assessment, taking stock of a man who hadn't yet declared himself fully. That was done. What he was walking through now was knowledge. They knew exactly what he was, and they were watching him leave, and the watching had the quality of something completed. Final. He didn't look at any of them. He put his briefcase in the back seat. He got in. He started the car. He sat for 1 second with his hands on the wheel, looking at the front of Everett's, the old sign, the worn siding, the light in the windows. Then he put the car in reverse. He didn't look back when he pulled out of the lot. He didn't look back when he turned onto the road. He drove east, and the diner got smaller in the mirror, and then the road curved, and it was gone. Inside the diner, the room exhaled. Not a visible thing, nobody made a sound or changed their posture dramatically. It was more like the change in air pressure when a storm that has been building finally breaks. The shift from one kind of atmosphere to another that you feel before you can describe it. Carla sat down on the stool behind the counter. She hadn't sat down since before 9 in the morning. Pete signaled for more coffee. She got up and brought the pot over without a word and poured it and went back. Hank was still near the window watching the street where the motorcycles had been. One by one, the engines had come to life, not dramatically, not in coordination, just the natural dispersal of men who had been somewhere for a reason, and the reason was finished. They'd pulled out of the lot the way they'd arrived, unhurried, and the street had reasserted its ordinary self, and now it was just a street. Hank turned from the window. He walked across the room to where Maggie was sitting, the table in the center, the table where it had all happened. He stood in front of her and had the expression of a man who has been composing something since 10 o'clock in the morning and still isn't sure he has the right words. He stood there for a moment. "Maggie," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm sorry," he said, "for sitting there this morning and not saying a word. You were right in front of me and I—" He stopped. "I've known you since before you started here. I knew Dale 30 years, and I sat in that booth." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "You weren't the only one," she said. "That doesn't help." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." She looked at him. "But Hank, you didn't leave. A lot of people paid their check and went home. You stayed. And you made that video and you sent it somewhere before it could disappear. Not soon enough." "Usually we don't," she said. "That's the hard part about being a person. We know what we should have done about 10 minutes after we should have done it." She looked at him. "You did something. That's what matters now." Hank stood there another moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her, the chair Derek had sat in, and he sat down. Carol came over. Pete followed. Carla came out from behind the counter and pulled a chair to the end of the table. Jimmy came out of the kitchen and stood at the edge of the group and then found a chair too. Nobody said anything that needed to be said. They just sat there in the warm, worn air of the diner that smelled like 40 years of mornings. And after a while, Carla got up and brought coffee for everyone, and they drank it, and the afternoon moved on in the way afternoons do when the worst of something is behind you. At 3:30, Ray came back through the kitchen door. He moved through the dining room and sat down at the table by the window, the booth that had been Hank's all morning with the best light in the room. Maggie brought 2 cups over, sat across from him. Outside, the October afternoon had gone golden, the low light coming in at an angle that made everything look more substantial than usual. The old buildings and the empty street and the hills at the far edge of town. They sat without talking for a while. They had always been comfortable in each other's silence. It was one of the things that happened between people who trusted each other and didn't need to fill space with sound. "You should have called me sooner," Ray said, when he first started coming in. "I didn't know what it was going to be," Maggie said. "Not at first. And when you did, I wanted to handle what I could handle myself." Ray was quiet. "I know," she said before he could say it. "I know." He turned his cup in his hands, looking out the window. She looked at him and saw what she always saw, the version of Dale that had made it into him. Dale had always watched the world from slightly outside it, as though understanding the shape of something was more useful than reacting to it. Ray had the same quality. She didn't know if it was learned or inherited. It didn't matter. "Uncle Jimmy showed me the paper today," Ray said. She nodded. "Dad never told me about it." "He wouldn't," she said. "He didn't do things to be known for doing them." Ray looked at the window for a moment. "He didn't do anything small either," he said. "Did he?" It wasn't a question, and she didn't answer it as one. She looked at her son, and she thought about the man who had written his name on a piece of paper 40 years ago as a simple act of care with no expectation that it would ever matter. Things mattered in the long run in ways you couldn't predict and couldn't plan for. You just had to be the kind of person who did the right thing when the moment came and hoped the moment eventually came. It had come, as it always did one way or another for people who did the right thing. "Go home, Ray," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to finish closing. Jimmy will walk me to my car. I'll be fine." She held his gaze steadily. "You have people waiting on you." He held her gaze for a moment. That brief reconsideration, she recognized the check, the assessment of whether she meant it or was just saying what she thought he needed to hear. He had done this since he was a boy. He had learned it from her. He decided she meant it. He drank the last of his coffee and stood up and put on his jacket and picked up his helmet from the end of the counter. He walked toward the back and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her one more time. "Call me," he said. "I will." He went through the kitchen. She heard him say something brief to Jimmy, too low to make out the words, just the tone of men who understand each other and don't need much. The back door opened and closed. In a minute, she heard the engine start in the lot. Then it faded down the road. Then it was quiet. Maggie finished closing by 5:30. She wiped down the last of the tables and turned off the counter lights and hung her apron on the hook by the kitchen door. The same hook, the same apron, the same end-of-shift gesture she had made 11 years of Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She checked the back door was locked. She said goodnight to Jimmy, who was still in the office moving papers in the way she had heard him move papers earlier, but with a different quality to it now, less weight, more purpose. She drove home in the October dark. She ate dinner by herself, which was how she usually ate dinner, and she watched a little television, which she didn't usually do, and she was in bed by 9:30. She lay in the dark for a while. She thought about Dale, which she did most nights to varying degrees, but tonight the thinking was particular. Not grief exactly, more like a long conversation. She was continuing the kind you have with people you have known completely, even when they are no longer there to answer. She thought about the envelope in her coat pocket, the handwriting on it, the 40-year-old decision of a man who had done the right thing without knowing it would ever matter, who had pressed his name into a piece of paper as a simple act of faith in people he loved and then gone about the rest of his life. She thought about Ray sitting on the back step with her, his big hands resting on his knees, listening to his mother the way he had always listened. She thought about Carla, who had been carrying a secret for 2 years and had finally found the person to give it to. She thought about Hank, who had picked up his phone at some point during the morning. She still didn't know exactly when, and pressed record. She thought about Jimmy moving papers in his office with a different quality to his movements. She fell asleep. The alarm went off at 5:15. She got up the way she always got up, made coffee, looked out the window at the dark yard, the wooden fence, the strip of sky above the roofline of the house across the alley, beginning its slow move from black to the dark blue that comes before gray. She put on her shoes, her coat. She drove to work. The lot behind Everett's was empty and quiet when she pulled in. She unlocked the back door. She turned on the kitchen lights. She put the coffee on one pot for customers, one for Jimmy, the stronger version, and she started on the dining room. Chairs off tables, napkin dispensers filled, menus wiped down. The morning moved. Jimmy came in at 6:45 earlier than he had arrived in a long time. She heard something different in the sound of the back door, less resistance in it, the hinge catching without the same weight behind it. He came into the kitchen and she poured his coffee without being asked and set it on the counter. He picked it up, held it, looked at her. There was enough in that look between two people who had known each other long enough to speak without words to say what needed to be said. He nodded once. She nodded back. He took his coffee to the office. She heard him settle in. The sounds of a man at his desk, papers a drawer. The ordinary sounds of a day beginning. Sounds she had heard 1,000 mornings. They were the same sounds, and they were not the same sounds because the person making them was not the same person he had been yesterday. The first customers came in at 7. At 7:45, the bell above the door rang, and Hank came in and Carol and Pete behind him, and they went to the booth by the second window without a word from anyone about it. She brought the coffee over, set it down. "Thanks, Maggie," Hank said. "Of course," she said. She moved on. The morning light came through the front windows and shifted as the sun came fully up, the pale, sharp light of October, at its best, the kind that makes worn surfaces look like they were worth wearing. It reached the chrome of the counter stools and the edges of the tables and all the way back to the kitchen wall where the old photograph hung in the place it had always hung. She passed it on her way to the front and glanced at it the way she always did, brief, automatic, the way you check that something you need is still where you left it. It was 3 men. Opening day, 1987. The one at the edge of the frame, not looking at the camera, already looking at whatever came next. She kept moving. On her right hand, a simple ring. Silver. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it was never meant to. If you looked at the inside of the band, which you wouldn't because it was her ring on her hand, you would find 2 words. Worn smooth from 26 years of mornings, exactly like this one. Her husband had put it on her finger and told her that the name meant something, that it meant the people you loved were not alone, that it meant someone would always come. Dale Callahan had been right about most things. He had been right about that one too. And so the morning went on the way it always did. The coffee made, the door opened and closed, the bell ringing above it, the familiar names called out and answered the business of a place that was still standing. The arithmetic of 40 years of ordinary days added together into something that could not simply be bought and demolished by a man with a briefcase who had looked at the room and not seen what was in it. You could not always know looking at a thing what it was made of. You could not always know looking at a person what they had behind them. And if there was a lesson in any of it, in Maggie and Ray and Jimmy and Carla and Hank in the envelope with the 40-year-old handwriting and the 23 motorcycles that filled a parking lot in silence, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, it was simply this. A good person is not a weak person. It had always been true. Some mornings you just needed someone to find it out.